Hi there, it's Emma, and welcome to Sax Bites, the 5-minute saxophone lesson podcast. Today is a part 1 episode on tuning tips. It really frustrates me when people label the saxophone as a really out of tune instrument because that's just not the case. You just gotta know how to wrangle the beast, how to work on those little things that make a huge difference when it comes to intonation. Plus, I think the saxophone gets a little bit of a bad rap in beginner bands and primary school and lower school programs where kids are just starting out and, their intonation isn't great at first, but it can get better. For a lot of students, their main introduction and quite often the only form of tuning they do on their instrument is to play a single note, say a concert B flat or a concert A, into a tuner, adjust their saxophone mouthpiece, and off they go. They just go and play. But there's a lot more that I like to introduce into the routines of my younger students that sets them up for greater success in intonation later in their musical journey. It really comes down to having better habits with their ears. And that's about getting them to listen more carefully to their own playing, but listening to other saxophone players and one resource that I absolutely love, which is the tuning CD. A lot of students will realize when they're out of tune, but they're not actually able to identify if they're flat or sharp or what it is specifically that needs to be adjusted to get them back to where they need to be. So with very young students, I actually like to have a little experiment with moving mouthpieces around and getting them to figure out if something is flat or sharp. And when I say moving mouthpiece, I mean pulling a mouthpiece almost the entire way out or pushing the mouthpiece almost the entire way in to really exaggerate, almost to the point of a whole semitone, the bad tuning, the bad intonation. And then you can make that even more subtle, even less mouthpiece movement, and over time students actually get much better at identifying what the intonation problem is. But then you're faced with the situation that they might then go into a band rehearsal or an ensemble rehearsal, and it's once I've reached that point that I introduce the tuning CD. This is something I recommend to all my students, not just saxophonists, all my woodwind kids, and in fact anyone, brass, I can't recommend it enough. And I get students to play long tone scales over the top of the tuning CD. In doing so, they now need to not just match pitch for pitch, is my concert A in tune with my teacher's concert A, but instead they need to listen to each note of the scale and its relationship back to the tonic. So the tuning CD plays a whole heap of low drones. From memory, I think it's about 3.5 minutes each track. And let's say it's a concert A drone, you're going to play a concert A major scale on your instrument very slowly and listen to the relationship of the tonic, the supertonic, the median, etc. as you move through the scale. And that's where I like to introduce relative intonation. So I'm looking at how students are responding to and listening to the tuning CD and making adjustments to make sure they're in tune. Because quite a lot of young students, and this episode is primarily focused on talking about tuning with young students, don't yet have an understanding of how they may need to adjust a note within a scale or within a chord to make sure it actually sounds in tune. This is something as an instructor, as a studio teacher, your ensemble directors that you work with, that your students go and play in those bands, is going to appreciate a lot. And it can be done at a much younger level than a lot of teachers will introduce it. Getting students to understand the difference between playing a major third in a chord or a minor third in a chord, or even knowing that they're playing the third in the chord when they're in band rehearsal, is something that very young students can accomplish. And we want to make sure in our lessons we're making that happen. So, when my young students go home, I encourage them to do several things. The first is to get them in the habit of tuning themselves at the start of every practice session. This is a hard one to get them to do, but once they're in the habit, it pays off greatly. Firstly, with super young ones, I'd say they can just tune with the tuner. As they get older, encourage them to actually tune with the pitch generator to listen to the tone, tune themselves, and then just check with the main function of the tuner. And then to get them to try using the tuning CD and incorporating the tuning CD into their technical routine. Long tone scales are the quickest, simplest, and easiest way to use that resource. And finally, as they're playing through repertoire, whether that be ensemble music or solo music or whatever it is that they're working on, have them identify spots where they think they may be out of tune or that they think it might be a priority to make sure that particular moment is perfectly in tune. Think a sustained held note, a chord in an ensemble piece of music, or the final sustained chord with the piano accompaniment at the end of a solo piece. It's a great starting point for young players with intonation, and in my next episode, I'm going to focus on tuning tips for slightly older players and more advanced saxophonists. Until next time, this has been Sax Bites, the 5-minute saxophone lesson podcast. Goodbye!